Hi, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to part 2 of Lecture 15, Ring of Gyges. We'll return to our discussion of what's going down in book or chapter 2 of Plato's Republic. In the first part, in the first video, we gave some background with respect to Plato and Socrates, talked a little bit about who they were, how important and influential they are in the history of philosophy. Talked about the Republic itself and how important of a work this is in the history of philosophy as well. And of course, it's the book from which our excerpt is taken. So the Ring of Gyges, that famous excerpt from book 2 or chapter 2, is again from the Republic. So in the part 1 video, again, we talked about Plato, Socrates, the Republic, and we got into then this discussion. So we set the stage for our particular excerpt, talked about what happens in book 1, right? They're discussing the definition of justice. What does justice actually look like? What does it mean to do the right thing? And at the very end, I mentioned of this book, right? We have this character known as Thrasymachus. He erupts and issues this challenge, which then sort of demarcates a shift in the focus of the Republic from that point forward, from that discussion of the nature of justice, what justice is, to the usefulness of justice. In what sense is it desirable to us? And that challenge, again, Thrasymachus' challenge, was Socrates, prove to me that the just individual lives a better life, because I am of the opinion, Thrasymachus, and apparently most people, right, they are representing, Thrasymachus and Glaucon are representing the common view. I am of the opinion that the unjust person, provided they can get away with stuff, right, actually lives the truly the best life. So the Thrasymachus challenge, and famous challenge that's issued to Socrates, is prove to me that the just person lives a better life. And so as I've been maintaining throughout the part 1 video, really what the rest of the Republic is about, so 90% of what this book is about, is then that very issue, that very debate. Socrates, in some sense, trying to defend the idea that justice isn't only good for its consequences and what it gets us in terms of when we appear just, but it's good in and of itself in its very nature for us. And of course, famously, the Republic then delves into a psychological analysis of we'll get into that actually here in a little bit, the constituent parts of the individual psyche and what a just relationship amongst those parts looks like. And then they blow it up too, and they famously talk about, what a just city would look like and the different forms of political states or cities that you can have and what the just one would look like in terms of the different types of people within the city and how they would be orchestrated or oriented towards each other and so on. So, they talk about it in a very microscopic sense in the individual level, and then they blow it up in terms of, magnify it and blow it up and discuss it in terms of whole cities and states and what justice looks like. And so Socrates, again, is trying to defend the idea that justice in all these senses is always going to be good in itself, in addition to whatever good consequences are associated with also then appearing just. Okay? And we got into that then. We sort of fleshed out what the debate is all about. We talked about then and really outlined the opponent's view, or from Socrates' position, right? Glaucon. So Glaucon picks up the argument on behalf of Thrasymachus and really pushes against Socrates so that he can then tease out the best response from Socrates. So at the end of the lecture, or the first part, the first video, we then sort of outlined Glaucon's position, right? The Socrates' opponent's view. The idea that when we act justly or do the right thing, it's only because we feel compelled to, out of necessity, not because we really want to, but it's kind of the lesser of the evils available to us. And so we presented then, right, in that part 1 video, Glaucon and Thrasymachus and the common view of morality or justice, presented their case. And so what we're going to turn to in this part 2 video is then Socrates' defense of his position. He's going to try to argue, if you go back to the 3 types of goods, so we talked about the Ring of Gyges, the 3 types of goods, the thought experiment that Glaucon offers, juxtaposing the perfectly just and the perfectly unjust. We talked about, all those different ways that he makes his case, right? Glaucon, that is. And if you go back to the 3 types of goods, Socrates, again, is going to try to argue. So in this video, we're going to present Socrates' position. He's going to try to argue that in addition to getting us good stuff for appearing just, right, and avoiding bad stuff for appearing unjust, justice, doing the right thing, it's going to be good in and of itself for us. Okay? And then conversely, doing the wrong thing, even if we can get away with it, like in the Ring of Gyges, that's not going to be good for us. Okay? So again, the idea that regardless of the consequences, good or bad, justice and doing the right thing, whatever that might look like, whatever the nature of it might be, doing that is good in and of itself. So that's Socrates' position. So we'll again lay out to do justice, if you will, to his position. We'll talk about some of the more general sort of themes you see in Plato / Socrates and their philosophical view. Right, the general idea, for example, that evil is ignorance. And so even though you might see people indulging in injustice when they can do so without consequence, they're doing so ignorantly, Socrates is going to argue. And again, just because somebody does something that seems unjust and they seem to do so willingly, it doesn't mean that that's actually what's best for them. Okay, and so this is a very famous idea, and we'll go through sort of what this amounts to. Okay, and then we'll go through and highlight what I suggest are the two key arguments that we can glean for this position, right? This conclusion that all evil is a manifestation of ignorance or a lack of intention on the part of the person doing the evil. We will again go through what I've labeled, for better or worse, the external argument and the internal argument. So we'll highlight the external argument that comes from the Apology. So more on that here in a moment. The dialogue of Plato's that chronicles Socrates' trial. So that argument actually Socrates puts forth in his own defense at his trial. And then we have the internal argument. This is actually fleshed out in great detail in the Republic itself in the remainder of the books or the chapters. And I thought it was sort of disappointing that we only see Glaucon and Thrasymachus' position. We saw no indication of, in our excerpt, right, no indication of Socrates' own position and what his defense is going to be. So I will offer that to you, through this discussion. And so we'll ultimately then arrive at the conclusion, right, that given all of this, that regardless of the consequences associated with appearing just or unjust, you always ought to do the right thing or what's just, because it's actually in your own interest at all times. Okay? And I think that's also interesting to note here at the outset. I mentioned this in the part 1 video, that Socrates actually appeals to our self-interest. Okay, remember Glaucon and Thrasymachus and Pals, they're very Hobbesian, they're very egoistic in how they present things. And Socrates is going to say, well, appeal to our self-interest, it's actually against our own interest to be doing what's immoral or unjust. And so that's what he's going to try to show here. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and dive into each of these in turn here. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit. This is slide 12 of the lecture notes. Again, we want to talk a little bit about Socrates' trial, from which we get what I call the external argument for this idea that all evil is ignorance. So Socrates, I talked a little bit in the introduction in the part 1 video, talked a little bit about this figure of Socrates and how he was very endearing to a lot of people, especially the youth. The youth are always more rebellious in spirit, you might say, and for whatever reason, as we get older, that sort of dies down. Maybe we're just saturated with the practical affairs of daily life and trying to make ends meet, and we no longer have the willpower to be as rebellious as we were in our youth, for whatever reason. Just a general observation, right? When we're younger, we tend to, especially like pushing against tradition and so on. And so many of the youth of Athens in particular were big followers of Socrates. And so I mentioned in the part 1 video how he drew quite a cult-like following, but at the same time, then the people that he exposed and showed to be ignorant of all the things they suggested they knew, they then grew to despise Socrates. And so he's applying that Socratic method. We talked a little bit about that in the part 1 video, that kind of back and forth. You suggest what the gods know, well, yada, 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 Socrates would say, and then the back and forth, and the person he's discussing things with eventually, realizes the error of their ways or that they're ignorant. Hopefully, sometimes they'll just run off and say they have too much to do, can't be bothered by these trifling affairs, Socrates. At any rate, so some of these people though that were following Socrates, they started emulating that Socratic method as well. And some of these youth started doing that as well. They'd go home and start applying the Socratic method to mom and dad. Some of these moms and dads were in positions of great power, and you can sort of connect the dots. why is little Billy questioning everything we do now? And what's gotten into him? Oh, it's that darn Socrates, right? And so again, many people who had positions of power uh, grew to despise Socrates, and that ultimately led him then, again, given this faction within Athens that grew to dislike him, he was eventually brought to trial at an older age for two charges: corrupting the youth, uh, naturally the moms and dads. Right when little Billy came home and started questioning everything mom and dad did, they weren't too keen on that, and so one of the charges was that Socrates was corrupting the youth, and the second charge was famously of atheism, that he didn't believe in the gods at the time. And so we'll talk about what's interesting, and it's kind of ironic. There's a lot of irony in it, and again, that's something you'll pick up a lot on if you read the more you read Plato and his dialogues. But it's very ironic, Socrates, in terms of what led to his downfall and where all this started. He's actually going to attribute it to him following the Oracle of Delphi and sort of trying to figure out what the Oracle meant, which the Oracle is basically the voice of God, the gods. So here he is being charged with atheism, and yet he's more or less everything he's doing is sort of an acknowledgement in some sense of what the voice of God, the gods had suggested. So sort of ironic there. We'll say more about that here in a little bit, but let's turn again to Socrates' trial and the dialogue of the Apology, wherein we get, again, this general idea, and this comes out in many of the dialogues. Again, it's a theme that you see in the Republic as well. This general idea that all evil, whenever somebody does something wrong, right, that it's a reflection of ignorance or a lack of true intention on the part of the person. And it's an indication of the lack of intention on the part of the person, because nobody, as we'll see, right, will do anything on purpose that would harm themselves. And so Socrates is going to suggest that all evil, doing an unjust thing, that is implicitly against our own interest. And so insofar as we still do it, well, then we must be doing it ignorantly. That's going to be the gist of the external argument, actually. So that's the argument, the gist of what he says in his own defense in the Apology. Then this is, again, a dialogue of Plato's that chronicles Socrates' trial. And it's, for what it's worth, it's one of the few, I believe, dialogues where we have sort of verification that this is kind of indicative of what Socrates really said. Again, I mentioned at the beginning of the part one video that there's a lot of question marks regarding the real Socrates. Will the real Socrates please stand up? We don't know in many regards the true nature of Socrates, but apparently the Apology, right, it actually is indicative of what a lot of what Socrates said at his own trial. So he's put on trial for corrupting the youth and atheism, and so when he's sort of offering his defense, then he makes an appeal to this idea again that whatever evil or harm has been done, that it was a reflection of ignorance on his part, and so rather than being punished, the idea is, they ought to be enlightening him if he in fact is guilty of a harm or evil here. Okay, so let's kind of flesh out what the actual argument is, and so that's what I do, turning to slide 13. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn to slide 13. So in making this case at his own trial, so he's going to try to argue that, look, what he really thinks is he hasn't corrupted the youth. Okay, he says, look, either I haven't corrupted the youth, or if I have, I did so unintentionally and ignorantly. And so in either case, because the Athenian court of law, like many crimes in our court of law, you had to have the intent there in order to prosecute. He's going to say that in any case, either of those cases, either I didn't actually do the harm or I did so unintentionally. In either case, you shouldn't be prosecuting me. At most, you should be enlightening me if it's found out that I really did something harmful, because it was unintentional on my part. You ought to be educating me, not putting me on trial and ultimately executing me. So what is what I call the external argument? And by the way, these are just my phrases, okay? Don't go Googling these, trying to find the external. I mean, you might just find my notes. This is what I'm labeling what we're about to unpack here, which is, an argument he offers in the Apology, in his own defense at his trial. Again, it's an argument in defense of this position, the idea that all evil is a reflection of ignorance. And then the internal argument, we'll flip to that here in a moment. It's a sort of a different way of arriving at the same conclusion, that when we do evil or unjust stuff, it's a reflection of ignorance on our part and a lack of true intention on our part. So what is this external argument? Let's unpack that here. So basically he says, again, this is what he says in his trial, in his defense. He says, look, no one likes to be harmed, okay, when we're acting rationally, okay, and hence not ignorantly, okay, when we're acting rationally, the idea is that no one likes to be harmed. So we're not going to do something that we know is going to bring about harm to ourselves. We're not going to intentionally bring about harm to ourselves when we're acting rationally. That's premise one. Premise two, the idea is, look, if somebody I live with is harmed by me, then I have increased the likelihood that I will be harmed in return. So if you couple that, the idea that when I harm someone, they're more likely to harm me, or I'm more likely in some sense to be harmed in return, couple that with the first premise, no one's going to intentionally do something that will bring about harm to themselves, then he's going to try to argue, insofar as we still harm others, we're not thinking it through, right? Because we're failing to realize the sense in which we're standing to lose ourselves, right? In the sense that when they return that harm, or possibly at least, right, a great likelihood that they will return that harm, that's going to hurt us, and we're not thinking clearly. We're not seeing that is the implication here, because again, no rational person acting rationally is going to do something they know is going to bring about harm to themselves. Okay, so the conclusion, coupling those two premises together, look, I either didn't harm them, the youth, right, of Athens, or if I did so unintentionally, right? Because I wouldn't harm them, right, knowing then that I stand to be hurt then in return. And so you can kind of, what are the merits to this argument? I mean, you can kind of get a feel for, what he's getting at here. If I punch you in the face, then obviously it's a lot more likely that I stand to be hurt here, right, in return. And that stands to reason. That kind of makes sense. And applying it to his own situation, he's suggesting that, look, if I really have corrupted the youth, and eventually they grow up and assume positions of power and enact corrupt laws, then, well, that's going to harm me. I'm going to be then susceptible to those corrupt laws and be harmed as a result of my corrupting them in the first place. And why would I do that, right? Because I don't want to bring about harm to myself. Again, no one will intentionally bring about harm to themselves. Okay, so again, the upshot of all this is I didn't really do it, okay? Either I didn't harm them, or if I did, it was unintentional. I wouldn't intentionally do harm to them, because the idea is I only stand to be hurt in return, and no one of sound mind is going to do something that's going to increase the likelihood that they are going to be hurt in return. So that is the external argument. So pretty interesting case there. Again, the case he actually made in his own defense when he was on trial, which was again chronicled in that is in the Apology. A much shorter dialogue for what it's worth than the Republic. Okay. Now, let's say that somehow you could avoid, right, the ramifications of the external sense in which you'll be harmed. Of course, he's going to say, he'd probably argue that's never going to be the case, right? If you truly harm someone, even if they don't realize it's you that's harmed them, I mean, you and everyone else is only going to be harmed in return, because that's going to corrupt their nature, and they're going to do bad stuff as a result, and so on and so forth. And but let's just say that somehow you could avoid the ramifications of this, right? You could somehow harm them, and somehow you would not get harmed in return externally or from without. Okay? Well, look, you still have this internal case, you might say, or the internal argument for why it's never still a good idea to do unjust stuff. And that insofar as we do it, we're still doing it then ignorantly or unintentionally in some sense. So this is what I'm getting at on slide 14 when I discuss the internal argument. So to understand what's going on here, you have to appreciate this tripartite theory of the soul that is outlined in the Republic. And you also see glimpses of it elsewhere, but it's primarily in the Republic. You get it on the individual level. So Socrates and / Plato, they're going to suggest that all human beings, remember we talked about Aristotle and how he recognized three constituent parts of our human nature. And I mentioned at that time, right, well, Plato does the same thing, Plato / Socrates. Well, here we're seeing that, right? There's sort of tripartite theory of our psychology, or our basic nature, and it's fleshed out again on the individual level, and then it's also presented. And remember, we talked about at the beginning of the video here I talked about how he talks about justice in the city sense, or on a more political statewide sense. And he also relates these three parts to factions of the city as well. So this gets fleshed out, this sort of basic relationship between the rational elements of our human nature, be it either individually within or even within like a society or city, on a city level, right? There's going to be some people that tend to be more rational, some that tend to be more spirited in nature. They will be our soldiers and so on. The wide variety, or majority, I should say, the great bulk of people will be fixated on desire and cater to this. But we have different types of people then as well in cities, is the suggestion on Plato/Socrates part. And so we want the proper relationship amongst these constituent factions of the city as well. We want the right types of people in charge running the show, the philosophers, the ones steered by reason, and so on and so forth. Okay, so getting back on track here. So this all is fleshed out in the Republic. Of course, we don't get any glimpses of it in our short little excerpt, but Socrates then is going to elaborate in these many different ways that I just alluded to. And basically what he's going to suggest is that when unjust stuff is done, when an evil takes place, what happens is reason, our rational, our better element, of course he's a philosopher, that's been an ongoing theme throughout the course, right? They're all catering to reason. This is number one. What happens when we engage in evil, whether we're caught or not, is we're enslaving the better element of our soul at the expense, right? Or we're enslaving the better elements of our soul to the baser elements and letting these elements sort of rule or steer the ship. And ultimately, that's not a recipe for true happiness. We might think it's great, but we're sort of blinded by the moment, and we're not farsighted enough to appreciate how, robbing the bank and getting away with it, or with the ring and Gyges, right? Killing the king, taking the queen, and taking over the kingdom. Well, that's actually not truly in your own interest, right? So that's going to be the argument here, that anytime we indulge in evil, we're sort of letting this baser element of our soul take over. And the best way on face-to-face classes, the way I suggest that I've always best appreciated this is, I never have done heroin, nor have I ever, known someone personally, at least that I know of, that, has done heroin or has been addicted. But we've all seen shows presumably chronicling the perils of heroin addiction. And typically, how does it start? Well, they just cater to an innocent initial desire. And then what ends up happening, though? They start fixating, and pretty soon that is all that matters. And that's kind of Socrates' point, that hey, it might seem like it's great that we're getting away with stuff, that we're hoarding, we're able to rob the bank and get the material wealth and so on and so forth. But really, in the process, we're just becoming a slave more and more to especially those unnecessary desires. And so think of the heroin addict, where at first they were sort of still mostly, a rational agent, you might say, thinking clearly and so on, and they had the one initial desire. And what ends up happening? They sort of spiral out of control. Vice perpetuates vice. You remember Aristotle made the point, virtue perpetuates virtue. That's why we want to get in at an early age and mold the minds of the youth, right? And instill good habits at a very early age so that it's more and more likely to be the case down the road. Well, Socrates is making the exact same point in the flip side, or the opposite direction. Okay? You're better off getting caught robbing that bank from the get-go, because the more you get away, so to speak, with these evils or unjust stuff, the worse your own nature is going to become, and the more you're going to spiral out of control, because just like Aristotle said, virtue perpetuates virtue, while vice perpetuates vice. So again, you're never going to be able to escape this, regardless of the external consequences or circumstances, right? This relationship, you still always want to be steered by the rational or better element of your soul, Socrates would suggest. And don't get me wrong, he's not making the case that we should just completely expunge desire from our soul. Or no, the idea is we need the proper amount, right? These need to play their proper role. And what ends up happening, according to Socrates or Plato, who knows, right? What ends up happening when so many people are unhappy, right, is because they do unjust stuff, right? Or they're catering to this desire constantly. And they become the relationship between these constituent parts of their soul become out of whack, right? They're out of tune. Their soul is not properly tuned, you might say. And so that's when we engage in evil or unjust stuff, you are making your own soul more and more out of tune. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not. I just came up with that one, but hopefully it's kind of making sense. Okay, so he thinks we have these three basic. I should have explained these three basic parts. So this is our, that makes sense, right? Our rational, thinky, philosophical part. Spiritedness is, standing up for what's right, what you believe in, having a spirited nature. And then desire, catering to our wants and whims and so on. And so, just to repeat, it's not that we need to completely expunge one or the other, but they need to play their proper role. And so you could be, we know people that are too overly spirited. Socrates / Plato, they talk about what's the issue with having overly spirited people together. They're prone to conflict and fighting. Okay? So you can have too much of this. You can imagine Aristotle nodding his head here. Yeah, I understand, right? And clearly, the most obvious instance of a soul that's out of whack, you might say, is, and then what happens, the majority of the time, is that we cater too much to desire, particularly unnecessary desires. And so that's exactly what he's going to suggest is going on internally, okay? Whether we're aware of it or not. And most of us, judging by our behavior, evidently, are not aware of it because we still then do the evil. Hence, we don't realize how we're actually screwing ourselves over. And insofar as we're still doing the evil, then, well, we must be doing it ignorantly because we wouldn't do something if we knew it would actually bring about harm to ourselves. So we're not seeing how it's screwing ourselves over, and hence we're not truly intending to do it. If we realized, if we weren't ignorant of all the ramifications, we wouldn't have followed through with it. We wouldn't have robbed the bank, is the implication here. So, and that is a strong implication. We'll get into, what that says about the justice system. I know one of the, actually, kind of the next slide, slide 15, I talk about the insanity defense, which then is very much related. But, question 4 on reflection time is all about if Socrates is right here, it would seem like, should we be punishing anyone for crimes or evils? Okay, because again, insofar as anyone's doing an evil, it always seems to be an indication of ignorance, of a lack of true intention, because they don't realize that in doing the evil, they're only hurting themselves, and no one who's acting rationally, hence not ignorantly, would do something that would hurt themselves. And what's interesting, turning to slide 15 then, is we do seem to appreciate this Socratic point in extreme cases. So like the insanity defense, when you get somebody that's killed 10 people, right, just seemingly crazy, right? They plead insanity, and so the idea is they're not of sound mind, so they don't merit the same sort of punishment. Instead, they get locked up in an asylum or something like that. And so it's interesting because we are on board with that the extreme cases where they're killing 10 people. We're on board with this idea. Well, they're not of sound mind then, and really what Socrates wants to suggest is that's true of the entire spectrum of crimes or injustice or wrongdoings or evil, however you want to put it. Whether it's killing 10 people or stealing Dr. Musil's bubblegum, that's all an indication of ignorance on the part of the wrongdoer. Okay? So it's interesting, I think. Again, when it comes to those extreme cases, now maybe you're not on board with the insanity defense, but it is recognized in many courts of law. And so, at the very least, some courts of law seem to be on board with Socrates, but just with the extreme cases, we don't seem to apply the same analysis or approach to the entire spectrum as Socrates seems to want to encourage us to do. Okay, so that was 15. So obviously, you can tell the import or significance of acting properly from a moral perspective for Socrates. It's not only good for its consequences, but it's good in and of itself, and to such a degree, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and erase this stuff, that, he famously suggests that it's better to die nobly than to live ignobly. Better to die having done the right thing than to keep living, but in doing so having to do the wrong thing. So that is a prevailing theme in many of the dialogues. Better to die nobly than So, and you see this play out, as I've suggested in the part 1 video, in the carrying out of the execution of Socrates. Um, if there's, and I'll ask you to sort of judge what you think of Socrates' character in the reflection time questions, but, it's kind of fascinating. I always I'm interested to garner the opinion of people that first kind of become acquainted with Socrates, because he seems kind of like he's full of himself almost, and he's just so sure of himself constantly, that he can kind of rub people the wrong way, it seems initially. But again, he seems so confident of himself, right? In terms of knowing what the right thing to do is, and he's so convinced that sticking to that path is the proper thing to do, that he is not willing to escape, right? So he's sentenced to death. I guess I should have mentioned that earlier, right? So he's put on trial for corrupting the youth and atheism, and he's ultimately sentenced to death. And he says he's not surprised. He's surprised by how close the vote was in terms of putting him to death. But he's put to death, or sentenced to death. And while he's waiting to be executed, there's this escape that's planned by friends and family and so on. He could have escaped, no problem. But he argues, and so there's another in the dialogue that chronicles this. He argues, I have an obligation to uphold what's right here, and if the state decided that the best penalty that I warrant is death, then so be it, even though they're wrong. I still have an obligation to uphold what the state decrees, even if I think as I do in this instance, that they're wrong. And so because he thinks that's the proper thing to do, he will not then carry out the escape, and he stays there and famously swallows the hemlock and dies. And as we mentioned in the Aristotle lecture, it's interesting then to juxtapose Aristotle with Socrates here, because Aristotle gets condemned near the end of his life as well, and he actually flees then. And so I don't know, did Aristotle have a different view of what the just thing to do in that instance was? I guess he wasn't really on trial per se, or it's kind of a difference. It's not a perfect similarity or analogy, but nonetheless, they have different reactions when being kind of condemned by their fellow Athenians here. So the point here, right, is he believes so firmly in the value of doing the right thing that he even puts it above seemingly life itself. Now, is he right in doing so? Of course, we'd have people like Friedrich Nietzsche who would claim, well, this is a perfect indication of Socrates' diseased and sickly mentality. He's diseased here. This is an indication of a weak, unhealthy soul that suggests, it's better to cater to others and neglect one's own interest, and to die at any point than to live. Nietzsche would say that's crazy. That's an unhealthy perspective, one that will lead to death rather than a full, positive, healthy life, which Nietzsche is going to argue for. So he's going to suggest this is an indication of how sickly Socrates is. But Socrates, doesn't think that's the case, and this is oftentimes presented as a very noble thing, right? That this is one of the reasons why Socrates is judged to be such a good character, or have such a good character. And again, he does seem to. So I mentioned a moment ago, regardless of what your ultimate view of Socrates is, you got to say he does kind of live up to his convictions, or carry them out, up to even the hour of death, right? He's willing to at least stand up for what he believes in, even die quite literally for what he believes in. So, in fact, I think I mentioned this in the part 1 video. It's kind of interesting. He mentions to the jury, look, I'm so convinced that, what I'm doing is the right thing, and I'm on the right path pursuing justice or philosophy in general, and, knowledge in that deep sense, and questioning people and so on, that I won't change my ways, regardless of what you guys decide. Right? Because that's how convinced he is that, again, that he's doing the right thing here. And applying the Socratic method to those who profess all these types of knowledge and so on. So he says, again, I'm not going to stray from what I'm doing, even with the threat of death or whatever you guys might propose for a punishment. It's not going to sway me from doing what I think's right. Going back to this. And what's really funny is, again, it kind of gives rookies or people that aren't fully familiar with Socrates the idea that he's kind of full of himself, but he actually says in his, when he's offering his defense in the trial, that he's offering the defense not really for himself, because he's of old age, but really for all his fellow Athenians, because they're the ones that stand to lose by killing him, right, or losing him, because everything he does, he says, is basically for the sake of others, right? He's gone around questioning those in positions of power to ensure they're doing the right thing and on a path to justice and so on. And he thinks all that was again born out of a desire to do what's just and to help those around him in the process. And so he's of the opinion. So he calls himself a gadfly of the state, an annoying pest of the state. One that makes sure that Locke would say he's like one of the checks and balances for the state, making sure that again those that are in positions of power aren't abusing their positions of power and so on. And so he makes this appeal that, look, you guys are hurting yourselves, and hurting me. So he always thinks that he sticks to this path of justice, and that it matters to him. And so that speaks to then again how important he thinks it is in and of itself, regardless of what happens, even regardless if it ends up right in doing the right thing, it leads to your death. It's better to do the right thing in that case. Right? It's still better to do that. There's something redeemable or desirable about that, regardless of the consequences. Okay, so that was 16. I alluded to this earlier. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of Socratic wisdom and kind of, what. So they ask him at the trial, Socrates, what do you think was the impetus for you being here? Why is it that you are hated by so many here? What led to your downfall? Again, this is kind of the ironic part. So one of the charges, in addition to corrupting the youth, was atheism, not acknowledging, respecting the gods at the time. And yet, so they ask him, what do you think the explanation for this is? And he immediately says, well, it was because I heard from the Oracle of Delphi, which is basically like a messenger of the gods, the voice of the gods, if you will. So somebody had asked, who's the wisest person on earth? And the Oracle of Delphi said, Socrates. And this befuddled Socrates because he had always maintained that Socrates, these are the things like, is Socrates toying with us? But he says things like, all I know is that I know nothing. How can you know nothing if you know that, right? But he says things like that. And so is he pulling our chain, right? And this is what oftentimes leads people to question, Socrates, and is he just having fun with people and so on. But anyway, this perplexed Socrates when the oracle suggested that Socrates finds out that the oracle suggested Socrates was the wisest person on earth. Again, Socrates always professes to know nothing, and that's why he's always keenly interested in whoever suggests they have wisdom or knowledge. And when I say wisdom or knowledge in this lecture here, I'm talking about the deep kinds of knowledge or wisdom, right? Philosophical stuff, not how to turn on a microwave or, construct a shoe or something practical, but no, the deep stuff. And so Socrates had always maintained, all I know is I know nothing. And so he professed to always have no knowledge. So how could he be then the smartest man alive? How could that be the case? And so he then sets on a quest to sort of, the idea is, he says, more or less, if I can find one instance of somebody who's smarter than me, then I can take that instance to the oracle and say, what do you mean here? Clearly there's somebody smarter. But he goes through and he trying to verify what the oracle says, he starts questioning, various people, and this, of course, is throughout many, many years, and what ultimately leads to all the derision against him, right, is the people he questions start not liking it. But he goes and questions basically three groups, you might say. One are who we call like the lawyers and politicians. And Socrates, the sophist, as Socrates would say, not a fan of these guys. There's no redeeming qualities about these guys. My wife is a lawyer, has a law degree, so I can speak ill somewhat of this camp as well. This is Socrates' opinion anyway. But right, there's no redeeming. So he sort of questions these guys, this type of person, and what he finds out is there's really nothing redeeming about them. They just think they know all kinds of things, but really they know nothing. And so really all they have is a lack. Again, they lack that awareness of what they don't know. And there's nothing positive or redeeming at all about these guys. The second group is what we might call like artists. And he says, look, poets, and so on. With this group of people, there is something redeeming, there is something inspirational with what they produce and give us. But then he quickly says it's sort of like the divine working through them. They're not oftentimes in control. And then what's worse though, and more to the point, then based on their ability to do that though, they then profess all kinds of grandiose types of knowledge that they have no idea about, right? And so the idea is they get a inflated ego. They think they know all these things then that in fact they have no idea about, based on the things they might possibly know about their art. Okay, so again, they have a lack too in the sense that they don't appreciate the things they don't in fact know, right? There's no recognition of the limits of their knowledge. There's no awareness, hey, I don't actually know that or that, right? That ability to recognize what one doesn't know seems to be lacking in this group as well. And then finally, we have who you might call the craftsman, I guess. The average everyday person, the cobbler, or the person that has a job, that typical practical job. There is something redeeming about what they offer us, right? That's a damn fine good shoe that I have now. Thank you, right? But again, the same downfall we run into here that we ran into with the artists. While they did have some good to contribute, they as well fell into the tendency of thinking themselves wise in all these other respects that they really didn't know anything about. So they might have known how to construct a good shoe or turn on a microwave, but they didn't know, what comes after death, or what the truly just thing to do in this instance was, but they suggested they did, right? So again, what's lacking on all three of these cases? What's lacking is Socratic wisdom, an appreciation, an awareness of what we don't know. It's kind of like I think I point this out maybe on the next slide. It's like a negative knowledge, an awareness of what we do not know. Okay. So anyway, this was all on a quest to kind of confirm, or really he was thinking he was going to be ultimately he would find somebody to then bring to the oracle and show, you're not correct. But what he ultimately ends up finding out is, lo and behold, he is the smartest one, because he's the only one that has this Socratic wisdom. He's the only one that appreciates how little, in fact, he knows. So in this process, though, is when he exposed the pretense of wisdom in all these other people, which is why then he has this faction of Athens that grew to despise him. Okay. So after his search, he concludes he has a, quote, certain sort of wisdom such as may perhaps be attained by man. And again, this is wisdom with respect to the deep stuff, philosophical stuff. So, I do have a certain kind of wisdom. The only type of wisdom man or human beings can have with respect to the deep stuff. And that's this type of wisdom. So let's turn to slide 18. Right. I do have this kind of wisdom, the only wisdom with respect to philosophical matters that we can have. Socratic wisdom, this appreciation. What put me one up on all of these guys was that I being Socrates here, I had an appreciation of what I do not in fact know. Of course, I don't know anything, because all I know is that I know nothing. Socrates speaking, right? So I at least have this grand appreciation for everything I don't know, which is why I'm on a quest then to inquire with all those who do say they know stuff, right? And these guys, that's completely lacking. Right? So he seems to be the only one who recognizes he has no wisdom, which is precisely the kind of wisdom he thinks is attainable by man or human beings. So this comes from the Apology. He says, and I think this was after he was interrogating the first group. He says, quote, although I do not suppose that either of us knows anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. In this latter particular, then, I seem to have slightly the advantage of him. So we're all pretty stupid, but at least I realize I'm stupid, and that's why I'm smarter. And so he can't ultimately refute the oracle, right? Even though he has no positive knowledge per se. So I try to distinguish this in terms of positive versus negative knowledge. Right? I can't tell you what indeed does come after death, but I can tell you that I don't know. I do not know. I can tell you all things I don't know, right? And so what sort of puts him one up, right, is he has that kind of negative knowledge and awareness of all the things he does not know that all these people completely lack, and people in general, which then renders Socrates the wisest on earth, apparently. Okay. So in sum, Socrates thinks that all we can know about anything that really matters, ultimately matters, philosophical stuff, is that we don't really know anything at all. And that's the idea of Socratic wisdom. And so the wise ones among us will appreciate, acknowledge that, which apparently nobody in his time did. So that's the idea of Socratic wisdom. And that was on slide 18. So let's go ahead then and turn to slide 19 and wrap things up here by returning then full circle to the issue of what type of good is justice or doing the right thing. Remember Glaucon and Thrasymachus, and the view of the many, according to those guys, was that when we do the right thing, it's only because we want to appear like we're doing the right thing so that we get a good job, stay out of jail, so on and so forth. It's not because we desire anything about doing the right thing in and of itself. There's nothing appreciable about that, right? Remove the good consequences associated with appearing just, and we no longer have any incentive to be just, says Glaucon and pals. Right? And conversely, remove the threat of appearing unjust, and people start doing all kinds of unjust stuff. Right? Well, Socrates wants to say, what's the issue? Ignorance. Right? Again, and I tried to mention this. I did mention this, and I tried to, hammer that point home. You can't go just because people do, or do a certain something or believe a certain thing, that isn't indicative of truth, right? So just because they act a certain way, that doesn't mean that it's what's best for them. And so that's ultimately Socrates' response to something like the Ring of Gyges, is that when people suddenly change their behavior and start doing all that unjust stuff, they're not thinking through things. They're acting ignorantly. Remember, for all those reasons we alluded to earlier, right, with the external and internal arguments, they're not realizing how in perpetuating or doing that evil, okay, that they're still screwing themselves over. Even if you can remove all the threat of the external stuff, right, you're still screwing yourself over internally when you indulge in the evil or doing the unjust thing, right? You're enslaving the better, more rational element of your soul to the desiring element. And I always hold up, again, for the best sort of example to capture in my mind what Socrates is talking about there, the idea of the heroin addict. Okay, it doesn't start off real bad, right? I mean, they're still sort of generally steered by reason, and for whatever reason, they give in to the temptation that first initial time, and then what ends up happening? They spiral out of control, and then pretty soon they're completely consumed by the desire. Okay, and that's what Socrates would say would happen to a criminal or someone who perpetually did evil unfettered, right? Without being ever limited, they would continually spiral out of control until they just became completely fixated on unnecessary desires, and ultimately they're going to be miserable. Right? So that's the answer, right? Is that, again, you can't go off of what people tend to do. Don't give me a story and say, well, look, this is what Joe Blow or Gyges did. That doesn't actually indicate what's truly in Gyges' interest. Okay, never mind what he does. We're talking about what is in fact in his best interest, and what he did was not. Okay, Socrates would argue. Okay, and I mentioned this several times, that he's really offering his defense of his position throughout the Republic, and particularly in Book 9, then is where he outlines the rational, remember the spirited, and the desire, and he associates each one with an animal. So I mentioned that. Where is that? I think I mentioned that. I thought I mentioned the animal part at the top, and then put it right here. So like this is the human being, this is the lion, and so forth. He associates these different parts with different animals and so on. And so he's trying to make the point I mentioned earlier, right, where whenever we do or indulge in an evil, we're implicitly corrupting the proper relationship amongst these parts. And we don't realize we're doing that, or the idea is otherwise we wouldn't do it, right? Because we don't rationally do something that we know is going to hurt us. So even if injustice brings you worldly riches, okay, you're still, the best part of your soul is still being enslaved. Okay, so even though you think it's great, you get to rob the bank and you didn't get caught. No, it's not great. And the sooner you get caught, Socrates is going to argue, the better it's going to be, because this won't become quite as out of tune or quite as out of whack, right? You won't go down that spiral quite as much. Right? So he suggests that the opposite, the pursuit of justice, is going to facilitate the proper relationship amongst these parts then, right? Reason's going to steer the ship, so to speak. And again, you're not going to completely neglect desire or completely neglect your spirited element. But reason's still going to be steering the show, and you're not going to then spiral out of control like one indulging in evil or unjust stuff is likely to otherwise do. So the Ring of Gyges, you get a lot of discussions of rulers then, as I mentioned, right? You have cities or states, and so you talk about the best way to sort of rule them, and so you get a lot of discussions of rulers and so on. And so the Ring of Gyges, the idea is it's you can compare it to a ruler who unintentionally commands things that are detrimental to himself. So Socrates would say, again, he's about one of the most non-materialistic people you'd find, right? So he thinks, this materialism of, say, in our culture, that feeds these unnecessary desires, okay, and it will start to become obsessive for many of us, and you see that borne out then, and we have problems and addictions and so on and so forth. And so, again, the ruler, just because they think it's great that they can command those that are ruled to hoard material wealth for them, Socrates just say that's actually not in their best interest, even though they think it's great hoarding all the gold and so on. No, I mean they're still acting and ruling ignorantly. Well, the Ring of Gyges is just like that. All the people that would change their behavior significantly, they don't realize the error of their ways and how they're screwing themselves over in indulging in this unjust stuff. And they're ignorant. So this is a quote. It's very close to, it's in the Republic. He says literally, his error wasn't intended, end quote. So again, they're acting ignorantly. So just because some, perhaps even most, if not all, except for Socrates, people would act unjustly if given an opportunity, if given that ring, right, and they can be invisible and wouldn't have to worry about the negative consequences associated with appearing unjust. So even though most people would act a certain way, right, and try to do that unjust stuff, doesn't mean that's really what's most optimal for them. That's truly what's most desirable for them. And Socrates maintained, for all the reasons we talked about, that no, in fact, not catering to that evil, right, and indulging in injustice, that's actually what's most optimal, what is truly most desirable and good for you. So this then brings us to the conclusion. So it's never going to be, according to Socrates, in one's interest to do injustice. Okay, it's always, in addition to the consequences, good in and of itself to do what's just or what's right. And so Glaucon is wrong when he said in our excerpt on 111, when he said, quote, all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice. At the very least, Socrates doesn't agree, okay, for all the reasons, again, we mentioned. Okay, so that is Socrates / Plato. Very important figures, very interesting contributions to ethical philosophy. I mean, this idea that evil is ignorance, fascinating, has all kinds of intriguing implications. I mentioned, the upshot in terms of our justice system, and that kind of plays out. This whole there's this debate in the penal system. Is it meant to be, is it an instrument of punishment, or should it be rehabilitative, or should it be something in the middle? You get competing camps on that, and so of course it would seem like Socrates then would be completely on the rehabilitative camp end of the spectrum, right? We ought to be, since there was no true intent on the part of the person doing unjust stuff. It seems like they didn't really mean to do it. So then why would we ever punish them? Instead, maybe we ought to be educating them, having them read the Republic. Maybe we just need to force them to read this until they see the light, so to speak. But I don't know, Socrates. What if there are just some people that are so far gone? I mean, we still have to do something with people that are evil, right? I mean, so what do you guys think about the justice system? If Socrates is right, don't we still have to do something with the people that are, for whatever reason, whether it's ignorance or not, acting in these evil ways? Aren't there some people for whom it doesn't matter how many times they read the Republic, they'll never see the light? And we still have to do something about these types of people, right? But anyway, fascinating stuff there. What to do, if we grant Socrates and Plato their conclusion that evil is a reflection of ignorance, what do we do? Right? We still have this practical issue of there's still people doing evil, right? For whatever reason, call it ignorance. We have to do something, don't we? So turning to reflection time. What do you think about Socrates? What do you think of his character? Pretty fascinating guy. We've kind of unraveled some aspects of his nature, So hopefully you kind of have a good feel for who Socrates was at this point. Obviously, you'd have a much better idea if you read the entire Republic or several of the dialogues. But I was given some of the things we've said. You have a pretty good idea of his general nature. So what do you make of him? Is it really better to die nobly than to live nobly, or would somebody like Nietzsche be right? He would say something like, "It's never healthy or good to opt for death." And what about number 3 here? That idea of Socratic wisdom. Do you agree with the idea that he or someone like Socrates is in fact has the advantage over all these other people insofar as he has that full appreciation of what he doesn't know? Is that type of person better? Because he seems to suggest I'm better, not knowing anything, but appreciating all the stuff I don't know. Then remember, there is something redeeming about these guys, at least, right? They have some positive know-how, some contributions. This might be questionable because he says, is it God working through them? But at the very least, these guys contribute something good. But he wants to say he's still better off because in his complete recognition of all the stuff he doesn't know, that still puts him in a better place than these guys. Even though they have some practical knowledge, they still then think themselves wise in all these other aspects that they have no idea about, and so they completely lack this. And so Socrates suggests he's slightly better off. Well, is that the case? Do you guys agree, or do you want to suggest no? It's better to have some practical know-how or some sense of knowledge, and nevertheless not appreciate all the things you don't know. It's better to have that than no knowledge whatsoever, which Socrates supposedly suggests is the case for himself. Okay, and the fourth one is just again, what to do. If Socrates is right in terms of the justice system. What do we do with criminals? Given the idea that all evil is ignorance. Okay, so that is Plato and Socrates and this famous passage from the Republic known as the Ring of Gyges. We dabbled obviously with the idea of egoism here in Glaucon, Thrasymachus, and even presumably Socrates. He's not denying that people will in fact act this way if given that ring. They all seem to endorse then psychological egoism, this idea that people cater to, tend to, cater to their own selfish interests and desires. And remember, Socrates seems to suggest in not doing that, he's somehow divine or not human. So we've explored this idea of psychological egoism, right? This idea that we all pursue our self-interest and so on. What about the idea that that's the proper thing to do? That hey, there is this this notion of morality. Morality does exist, and doing the proper thing is doing whatever you want, whatever helps you survive and flourish. Well, that's an interesting idea. That's what the ethical egoist basically says, and that's what Ayn Rand is going to say in our next lecture, lecture 16, where we talk about ethical egoism. So it's going to be really interesting because most of these theories we talked about up to this point associate morality and justice with, in some sense, right, not focusing on ourselves, counting, including others into our consideration. And I think on the face of it, that's how most people, when they think of morality, that's kind of what a lot of people associate with it, right? Not being selfish. But then what Rand does, right, she comes in and says, hey, this idea of morality, I'm not a moral skeptic. There is such a thing as doing the right thing, but it's completely opposite of what all of you guys have been suggesting throughout all of history and all of these theories, for the most part, that we've gone through. They're all, it's completely opposite of what you've been suggesting. There is a right thing to do, and it's whatever you want. It's whatever will help you be happy and survive. Now, look, she could make nevertheless some very Hobbesian points. It's not going to behoove you. It's not going to lead to your flourishing and survival to kill a bunch of people because they're going to take you out in return, right? So then, granted that her ethical egoism, it might still behoove us to form contracts and agree not to do certain things, but Rand is going to come on and say there is such thing as a morality, and it's actually the proper thing to do is what you want. And so obviously that's completely different than what the utilitarians told us, the deontologists, the virtue ethicists, right? All these guys. Rand's going to come on and tell us, no, focus on yourself. Focus on yourself and stop acting on the standard of death like a suicidal animal, like all these prior moral theories encourage us to do. So that's what you have to look forward to for lecture 16. hopefully you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you when we discuss Rand then and lecture 16, ethical egoism. Thanks.